The tight end position has been the most disappointing position in fantasy football. But imagine for a second being the most disappointing player at the most disappointing position. So congratulations to Kyle Pitts for being the worst of the worst in 2023 so far. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Today we're going to be breaking down every matchup in week 5 and trying to find the tight ends that are going to give your fantasy team the best opportunity to bring home a dub this week. And you would think 2 less games on the slate this week, meaning that we have to dive even deeper to help make it through some of these buys, but it's actually a good thing because that's just 4 less tight ends that can disappoint us this week. All right, let's just hop right into it. Let's check out Chicago and Washington on Thursday Night Football. Cole Kmet coming off his best game of the season, but he's going to be going up against the defense that allows the fewest fantasy points to the tight end position so far this year. And they have faced some pretty decent tight ends so far this year. Zach Ertz, Dalton Kincaid, Dawson Knox. Even last week against Dallas Goedert, he didn't really make that big of an impact either. And for those of you hoping to start Cole Kmet this week, I just don't think he's going to be worth the risk on Thursday Night Football going up against a defense that has shut down quite a few decent tight ends so far this year. The Chicago Bears defense hasn't been able to stop anybody through the air yet this season, and they're in the bottom third of most points allowed to the tight end position. This could end up being a sneaky good week for Logan Thomas. He doesn't have a ton of upside, but when he's on the field and he's healthy, it does feel like Sam Howell continues to look his way a little bit more often. If you're looking for somebody to get you through this week that won't necessarily win the week for you, but won't give you a 0 either, Logan Thomas could be the guy that could help out with that. Evan Engram has been one of the most steadiest tight ends so far this season. He hasn't won you any weeks, but he also hasn't lost you any weeks either, finishing inside the top 12 every single game so far. But now he's going to be running into the Buffalo Bills defense that allows the second fewest fantasy points to the position. Not only that, but they allowed the 3rd fewest passing yards in the league as well. If you own Evan Engram, you may not be in a position to start anyone else this week. And that's the reason why I have him listed in yellow. Unfortunately, if you own him and there's no options out there on the waiver wire, you're going to have to roll with him and just keep your fingers crossed. He's definitely not in a great matchup this week, but hopefully Trevor Lawrence continues to look his way and we can get him 6 or so targets, which may just put him over about 5 points. On the flip side of things, the Jags have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. And throwing the ball against the Jags has definitely been a lot easier than running it against them this year. Now, Dawson Knox is highlighted in green while Dalton Kincaid is still in yellow for me. And that is because I believe Knox is going to have a really good opportunity to find the end zone this week. We've talked about it a lot with tight ends so far this year. When you take a look at the way that the tight ends for Buffalo are structured, Dawson Knox is getting all of the targets in the red zone, while Dalton Kincaid is getting a lot of the targets in between the 20s. Now, that could lead to a decent day for Dalton Kincaid, but for Dawson Knox, I highly believe that he is going to find a touchdown this week, and that's what makes him a little bit of a safer play for me over Dalton Kincaid. But right now, over on Underdog, Dalton Kincaid's reception line is set at 2.5 receptions for this week, and that is going to be my Underdog pick 'em to play this week because I'm going to go higher on the 2.5 receptions for Dalton Kincaid. And keep in mind, if you want to play along with this pick 'em or any of the other ones that we talk about, head on over to Underdog, download their app, and when you sign up and make your first time deposit, use code word Headliners. And they're running a special right now where they're going to match your deposit all the way up to $500. And while I believe Dalton Kincaid will go over the 2.5 receptions that we just talked about, I also don't believe that he'll score a touchdown this week, and that's what makes me a little bit more weary of him being right below Dawson Knox instead of maybe being a little bit more of a safer bet. Hey, kudos to Dalton Schultz. He finally showed up last week. He scored a touchdown. He was the 2nd receiver on the team, and I still don't know if I can trust him this week, even though he's going up against an Atlanta offense that has allowed the 5th most fantasy points to the tight end position. Right now for Dalton Schultz, when you take a look at what he's done, he's had 1 good week, but until we get more consistent with it, I don't know if I'm willing to risk it week in and week out. Will the volume be there? That could go to Nico Collins, Tank Dell, even Robert Woods in any given week. But I think we need to bank on potentially a touchdown. Atlanta allows them to the tight end position. He could definitely end up finding it, but you could really kind of see a stat line of like we saw last week, where maybe he only gets 30 or 40 yards. Maybe he only has 3 receptions, but that touchdown is what would help you out. For me right now, when I take a look at Dalton Schultz, he's going to be maybe a low-end tight end 1, but at worst, probably a high-end tight end 2. I think it's time that we finally call it quits on Kyle Pitts. And I know that rhymes, and maybe that makes you feel a little bit better if you're a Kyle Pitts owner, but his performance surely does not. I'm completely off board with him until he shows us consistent production for multiple games in a row. I've got no interest in starting Kyle Pitts, because we kind of live in this fantasy where we know how good of an athlete Kyle Pitts is, and that leads us to believe that he's got a high ceiling every single week. But in reality, he doesn't, because when you factor in his injury from last year, he's been in the NFL for basically like 2 full seasons worth of games at this point. He's got 3 touchdowns. Like, the guy hasn't done anything. He put together a decent amount of yards in his rookie season, but it was because they had nobody else to throw the ball to. Now that they're throwing the ball to Drake London, now that they're throwing the ball to apparently Jonnu Smith last week out of nowhere, Bijan's definitely incorporated into the passing game, Kyle Pitts just isn't seeing the volume. If you own him, you might not want to drop him yet, because you spent such high draft capital on him. You kind of want to see what happens the rest of the season. But we're not starting him. We can't anymore, because he's killing us every single week. So if you've been banking on Kyle Pitts, it's time to turn the page, and it's time to try and figure out who can we utilize in his spot until hopefully they all figure it out. Detroit's defense is playing superb right now. And one of my biggest issues with trying to utilize Hayden Hurst is the fact that they have some absolutely excellent athletic linebackers. So if Hayden Hurst is going one-on-one against linebackers, they have several guys that can do really, really good in coverage. Anzalone, Campbell, Rodriguez, all of these guys do a really good job and are athletic enough to drop back in coverage. So Hayden Hurst really finds himself in a position this week where he needs to score touchdowns. Now, Detroit has allowed some touchdowns to the tight end position this season, so that definitely could end up being an opportunity if they keep everything locked down on the outside. Is Hayden Hurst ceiling high this week? It's absolutely not, but there is a lot of touchdown potential, and that's why I'm going to leave him in yellow. But for Sam Laporta, let's go ahead and fire him up, because this could be another big week. The Carolina Panthers allow the 3rd most fantasy points to the tight end position, and the Detroit Lions are getting Jameson Williams back this week. So they're going to have Reynolds, Williams, and then obviously Amon-Ra St. Brown in the slot. That's going to be a whole lot of guys to keep an eye on. I'm sorry, but there are not a ton of guys at the linebacker position that can match up one-on-one with Sam Laporta and consistently beat him. It could be a huge week for Laporta, and he's definitely going to be inside my top 5. The only thing that concerns me is that if Detroit gets out to a big enough lead against Carolina, that they focus more on running the football, and that Sam Laporta loses some of that upside, especially if he doesn't hit it in the first half. And that's going to be the key. If Sam Laporta goes off in the first half, we are golden. But if Detroit is leading and he doesn't have a ton of fantasy points in the first half, the second half may not make you feel any better. This could end up being a solid matchup for Chigioco. The only problem is Chigioco hasn't even done anything this year. Even with guys being hurt, he's not being looked at, which is crazy considering how well he played down the stretch last year. He's just not being utilized right now. And on the flip side, for the Indianapolis Colts, this is not an easy matchup for them. And last week, they deployed 3 different tight ends. Kylen Granson, my boy Mo Cox, Mo Problems, and then, of course, Ogletree, who scored a touchdown. Now, Anthony Richardson is looking to the tight ends quite a bit. But at this point in time, it's just not enough volume going up against a tougher defense that's willing to say, hey, I'm risking it on this guy this week. So while Kylen Granson continues to be the leader of the tight ends in terms of targets, the other guys are still touchdown dependent. And when you take a look at how tough the matchup is, the volume may not be there either. If there was ever a matchup where Darren Waller is going to go off, it would be this week. So if you own Darren Waller, we absolutely have to keep him in our lineup for one more week. He's going up against a Dolphins defense that have allowed the 8th most fantasy points to the tight end position. And it's definitely a defense that can get worn down throughout the game and allow some bigger plays at certain times, because when you take a look at how quick their offense operates and how fast they can strike, the defense is out there probably a little bit more often than they would like to happen. But we're going to take advantage of that if we have Darren Waller in our lineup this week. So if you have him, don't get rid of him just yet. Let's try and see what happens this week. He's going to be a medium risk for me given how bad the New York Giants have been so far. But let's deploy him one more time. And if he still doesn't do anything this week, then we need to talk about moving on. And if the Miami Dolphins had a tight end that we could trust, then maybe this would be the matchup to also deploy them. But Durham Smythe is not a guy that I trust in any way, shape, or form. He gets a few looks now here and there, but not anybody that I'm super excited about, so we'll just plan on going with somebody else. The New Orleans Saints have 3 tight ends that we would even consider playing on a weekly basis. Juwan Johnson is the first one, and he's dealing with an injury right now, and we're just going to leave him off our board for this week. Jimmy Graham, I believe, is 86 years old and still playing in the NFL. And then you have Taysom Hill, who somehow is tight end eligible still. Now, the problem with Taysom Hill is he's like your dad's drunk brother, right? Like sometimes at the holidays, he'll show up with a ton of presents, and he's just like the greatest uncle in the world because he gave you everything that you wanted for the holidays. But then he shows up a couple of weeks later, again drunk, and he's hitting on your mom, and things look really weird, and your dad has to toss him out of the house. Like, it's either really high highs with Taysom Hill or it's really low lows, and there's no in between. And so far this year for Taysom Hill, it's been all lows. If you're still trying to start him at tight end, you're still doing it wrong, and you're losing because of it. Now, really this season, Hunter Henry only has one bad week. He was the tight end 1 after the first 2 weeks of the season, had a bad week 3, and he came back last week with an okay week. Nothing great, but not anything that would have lost your week for you, as I believe he scored around 6 or 7 fantasy points. Now, the problem is that this week going up against New Orleans, it doesn't get any easier. New Orleans has allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. And with Hunter Henry, he still is the guy. He still is kind of that Mac Jones, hey, I'm coming to you. Or maybe if Bailey Zappi continues to be the starter, Zappi will look towards him. But he's been the most reliable weapon so far in this offense. So while the ceiling is not there this week, I still would be willing to rank him as a low-end tight end 1 because hopefully the volume will still come to him. With Freiermuth now expected to miss this week with a hamstring injury, Mark Andrews will be the only tight end in this matchup that we'll be taking a look at. And it could go one of 2 ways, because when you look at the Pittsburgh defense overall, they've given up a ton of yards this year, which could greatly benefit Mark Andrews. But when you take a look at the fantasy points allowed to the tight end position, they've allowed the 6th fewest. Now, to start the year, that would have meant limiting George Kittle and David Njoku, but they gave up a touchdown to Dalton Schultz last week. So the opportunity for Mark Andrews is absolutely going to be there. We'll just have to keep an eye on this Pittsburgh defense and see if they limit some of that upside. I could see it going either of 2 ways. Either Mark Andrews puts together a decent day with like 70 to 80 yards but doesn't score, or maybe he doesn't put up as many yards, maybe only getting you around 50 or 60, but is able to find the end zone. Whichever one you get would be good enough for your fantasy lineup, though. Irv Smith Jr. could end up missing another week, and in his stead, Drew Sample hasn't done anything either. But we will take a look at Zach Ertz, who had another 10 targets last week. If you take away his week 3 game, in weeks 1, 2, and 4, Zach Ertz has 29 targets over those 3 games. That is a ton of targets to the tight end position that a lot of other guys just aren't getting right now. And given the matchup, he could absolutely be in for a pretty decent floor this week if he hits those targets once again. The Bengals are bottom 3rd in fantasy points allowed to the tight end position this year. And if Zach Ertz can get back to the same amount of targets that he saw in weeks 1, 2, and 4, it's definitely going to leave him with a pretty high floor this week. And if he scores a touchdown, a very high ceiling. Another matchup with 2 teams in the bottom 3rd most fantasy points allowed to the tight end position. Now, Dallas Goedert, I would have thought would have been in a much better position heading into week 5, but he just hasn't been utilized much this season. Now, his numbers are looking better over the last couple of weeks than they did in week 1. But how much is it truly ramping up for Dallas Goedert? He's just not getting a ton of targets right now. And even if this is the matchup where we could think that he would get some targets, I'm probably going to rank him as like a low-end tight end 1, and I'm going to look elsewhere if I need some more upside. But with Tyler Higbee going up against the Philadelphia Eagles, definitely will be taking a look at him to see similar targets compared to what we saw last week. I'm going to make this one really quick for you. The Jets and the Broncos would be one of the best matchups that a tight end could have this week. But Tyler Conklin and Adam Troutman are 2 tight ends that no one is considered even playing right now. I will say this, maybe Tyler Conklin could see, let's say 6 targets this week. But even if he does, how high does his ceiling really go? And do we think Zach Wilson is going to show up like he did last week? Kansas City and Minnesota will bring my Manscaped must-watch matchup of the week. Fellas, it is beard season, and if you want to step your beard game up like I did, let Manscaped help you out with a brand new line of beard products that you can get over on their website. All you got to do is head on over to manscaped.com. Use code word headliners when you check out, and you're going to get 20% off your entire order and free shipping. And this matchup with Travis Kelce versus TJ Hockenson is bringing 2 of the only tight ends that we can trust in all of football together in the same matchup. Travis Kelce and TJ Hockenson, there's really not a lot that I'm going to say about either of these guys. They both are 1 and 2 in the tight end rankings basically every single week. Travis Kelce has a high upside every single week. TJ Hockenson, even though he's coming off of a down performance, has seen some of the most targets in all of football at the position since he was traded to Minnesota last year. He's one of the safest tight ends that you can find. He does bring some touchdown upside, but even when he doesn't, he gets more than enough receptions and yards to give you a really good floor every week. Last week, we finally saw some of the upside that Jake Ferguson brings to the tight end position. Caught all 7 of his targets for over 70 yards, but this matchup against San Francisco could end up being a lot tougher. San Francisco has allowed the 9th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position this year. We know how good that defense can be. And Dak Prescott and the Dallas Cowboys offense do have a little bit of an issue with being more consistent. But to get this offense going, we really need to get Jake Ferguson and CeeDee Lamb going to help open up the run a little bit better for Tony Pollard. And also in that same sense, we got to be stretching the field a little bit better as well with Michael Gallup. I don't know if those things come to fruition this week. That's why Jake Ferguson is going to be in yellow, because he's a little bit of a risk for me to reach any type of an upside that we would want. And unfortunately this week, George Kittle is going to be a high risk play for me. He's definitely going to be a lower end tight end 1. I'm not going to have him nearly as high in my rankings as I have in the past. This is going to be a tough matchup going against a team with some very athletic linebackers that can stay toe-to-toe with George Kittle. We'll see if he can get a decent amount of targets, but unfortunately, the only really good game he's put together this year is when San Francisco's been dealing with some injuries. If everybody's healthy and on the field together, George Kittle right now just isn't the priority that he was last season when Brock Purdy was like tossing him a touchdown every single game to end the season. Even though last week was a disappointment for Luke Musgrave because he ended up leaving his game early with a concussion, he's getting a really nice matchup against Las Vegas this week and the bottom third of most fantasy points allowed to the position. Luke Musgrave should see a decent amount of targets. And the one thing that I'm looking for is when Christian Watson is fully healthy and is getting a little bit more of a snap count there, is that going to help open some things for Luke Musgrave because the defense is going to start getting pulled down the field. Let's keep our fingers crossed. So far, Musgrave has had some big plays, but he hasn't been as consistent as I would like to see. So hopefully this week in a solid matchup is when we see it. And as far as Las Vegas goes, it really doesn't matter because Austin Hooper isn't even being considered. There you got it, Headliner Nation. There's my analysis of every matchup in the NFL for week 5. Make sure you hit that like button for me. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you're new here. And of course, you got to leave me a comment down below. If you're an owner that's been dealing with George Kittle, Dallas Goedert, Kyle Pitts, one of the top underperforming picks that you may have had, who are you looking to this week to help solidify the position? I'm going to get out of here, though. Peace out, Headliner Nation. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.